Our next speaker will be Dr. Ian Sheldon, known throughout Ohio and in the classroom for his lively presentations that encourage unconventional thinking. Dr. Sheldon received his PhD in economics from the University of Salford in the United Kingdom in 1981. He served as a lecturer in economics at the University of Exeter in the UK from 1982 to 1990, before becoming an associate professor at the Ohio State University in 1990, where he currently holds the Anderson's Chair of Agricultural Marketing, Trade, and Policy. He was previously editor of the American Journal of Agricultural Economics and featured article editor for Applied Economics Perspectives and Policy. He has published widely in the fields of economics and agricultural economics with a focus on trade and policy issues. His recent research has focused on trade and intellectual property rights, trade and climate policy, product quality upgrading and trade liberalization, agricultural productivity and trade, and evaluating the impact of regional trade liberalizations. He became a fellow of the Agricultural and Applied Economics Association in 2019, one of the highest awards of an agricultural economist. Well, please welcome to the stage, Dr. Ian Sheldon.
Thanks, Bailey. Bailey's in my class right now, so I guess he speaks from experience in terms of the apparently unconventional teaching methods.
I wrote.
You wrote that? I could push you off the stage right now.
Yes, you can.
Okay, thanks everybody for being here this morning. It was, I guess some of you had a pretty tricky drive. It's always interesting to drive down from Worthington. Worthington's always clear because we have plenty of income in our budget. But as soon as you hit the Columbus High Street, you have to watch out. And I don't have my snow tires and my WRX yet. So anyways, I'm going to talk a little bit about, give you a little bit of global economic outlook, and then I want to talk mostly about what the risks to the global economic outlook are from the ongoing trade war between the US and China. So pretty much over the past year, if you take a look at the data, we've seen globally a very broad-based slowdown in the global economy in terms of both industrial production and international trade. So if you look at the blue line, that's, you can see from about the third month of 2018, you're starting to see a downturn in global industrial production. And you can see that's being tracked pretty strongly by the red line, which is the volume of global world trade. And we're actually seeing not just a decline in positive rates of growth, we're seeing negative rates of growth in international trade, which is perhaps not surprising given the nature of the trade war. So what's really driving this from a global standpoint is, first of all, we've seen a pretty large downturn in automobile production and sales of automobiles, and that's largely been driven by, in the European Union, there are new environmental regulations coming into play, and particularly we've seen a slowdown in Germany, which is obviously the major producer of automobiles in Europe and the major exporter of automobiles. And it looks like a lot of that is people are holding off automobile purchases as they start to think about switching from, particularly in Europe, from diesel powered automobiles to hybrids or electric powered vehicles. So we're seeing a lot of that going on in the EU. We've also seen a slowdown in China in automobile production and sales. You don't tend to hear as much about what goes on in China because typically those cars are purchased in China and maybe other parts of, poorer parts of Southeast Asia. But there it's partly because of implementation of environmental regulations and changes in tax rules in China. Secondly, we're seeing incredibly weak business confidence due to the US-China trade war. And if you add into that a topic not particularly favorite to my heart, Brexit, my head will explode if I even have to talk about it or think about it this morning. But that is adding hugely to uncertainty, which is leading to a slowdown in investment. If you see a slowdown in investment, you typically see slowdowns in rates of productivity growth and innovation. And finally, we're seeing a pretty significant slowdown in the Chinese economy. I think their growth rate for this year or next year, 2020, is going to be below 6%. You might all go, wow, it's still above the US, but we're talking about growth rates that have fallen from 8–9% over the past 3 or 4 years. So China's been slowing down anyways, the trade war has simply exacerbated that slowdown in Chinese economic growth. That slowdown in industrial production, as I've already mentioned, has fed into a decline in international trade growth. This graph shows you what percentage of global imports are taken by, I've just put in 3 major players here. The blue bar is the US and Canada. The orangey brown bar is the Euro area, and the red bars are China. And you can see as the trade war kicked in 2018, by the end of 2018, we're starting to see China in particular showing diminishing share of global imports, and you're seeing that feeding in particularly into the US and Canada. So pretty much everybody who does forecasts, I base most of my analysis on what I read in the IMF outlook. It comes out in October. It's really good timing for this meeting. So we're basically seeing risks are pretty much skewed to the downside. So we don't see much upside benefit in the global forecast. What are the risks? Well, we're seeing tremendous disruption to international trade, mostly due to the tariffs implemented both by China and the US, but of course the European Union retaliated against the US, Japan retaliated against the US. So we're seeing a certain amount of what's called trade diversion, where China imports from other countries and the US imports from other countries. But I think most importantly, we're seeing severe disruption to the value chains, to the fact that China is on one end of the assembly chain, the US has major assembly chains here in North America. Secondly, we're seeing big declines in risk appetite. In other words, investors, although the American stock market is still doing pretty well, if you look globally, you'll see there's been a lot of flight of money into safe assets, particularly US treasuries. And of course, that's one of the reasons that the dollar gets held up, is that when risk increases, you tend to see investment in US assets, particularly 10-year, 15, 20-year treasuries, which have obviously relatively low rates of return. And we've also got a lot of political uncertainty, mostly in Europe. That's in Britain because of the Brexit palaver, I guess, for a better word. I'm not sure the election is going to lead to any serious outcome to that. I think it's probably going to be a minority conservative government or a government with a small majority. So I think that uncertainty is going to persist. Germany's been slowing down significantly. We have other political uncertainty in Europe, but of course we have a lot of political uncertainty in Latin America right now, if you know what's going on in Chile. And of course the whole Hong Kong, China thing is adding to that global uncertainty, as well as what's happening in Syria with the invasion of northern Syria by Turkey. So the IMF is forecasting that if the trade war were to continue, the global economy stands to lose $700 billion by the end of 2020. To put that in perspective, that's the size of the Swiss economy. So the trade war as it's going on right now, if it persists and isn't ratcheted up further, we're talking about a loss of a single economy, Switzerland, to the global economy. Now, both the US and China are obviously affected by the ratcheting up of the trade war. This is again from the IMF forecast. This is based on the 2017 base of GDP. And if you just look at that bottom line for the US, this is real GDP, so this is taking account of inflation. The blue line is the early set of tariffs in April. Then you walk your way down through there where you get an effect on the stock market, you get an effect on the degree of investment uncertainty, and then you get this negative effect on productivity. And you can see the US, we're expecting by 2023 to have seen just under 1% decline in economic GDP just because of the trade war. China sees an even larger decline in its GDP on top of what it's already experiencing due to the slowdown in the Chinese economy. And in China, we're talking about maybe a 2% decline from the baseline in 2017. So the general view, and this is not just my view, this is a general view, this is the view of the IMF, this is the view of the World Bank, this is the view of the OECD. These are the 3 top forecasting agencies globally, are saying we really need to reduce trade tensions, and we need to return to solving international trade issues via the multilateral system. And by the multilateral system, I mean the World Trade Organization. And I'm going to make a few comments about that later on in my presentation. So that's the global situation: slowdown in production, slowdown in trade. The forecast is a decline in global GDP in the coming year. and China and the US are the two countries that are bearing the biggest brunt of the trade war necessarily. So why did the US take on China? And this might seem an obvious question, but I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to pick holes pretty much in all four arguments for taking on China. This is not just my view, this is the view of 99.999% recurring of international economists. So this is not, I'm not out on the tail of the distribution of trade economists here. So first of all, the idea was to increase US market access to China. And essentially what we did, what the administration did, was instigate a trade war via power-based bargaining. In other words, the US, prior to the current administration, was willing to follow the rules of the multilateral trading system, but has now gone in some sense rogue and forced China to go rogue as well and instigate this trade war. So here's a very simple graphic. There's actually any of my students in the class, Bailey, I see a few, oh, I see one of my former PhD students sitting over here. Good to see you. I thought I'd recognize you. And another student sitting back there I recognize as well. This is basically, this is a simple game matrix, but I don't really want to talk about game theory here. But you can see, if you look along the top bar, you have US policy, and I've just split it into lower average tariffs and higher average tariffs. And then down the vertical column on the left there, you have lower average tariffs for China, higher average tariffs for China. That blue box in the middle there, you can think of that as the result of 8 rounds of trade negotiations in the post-war period under what was then called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. So this began in the 1940s, went through the Kennedy round in the 1960s, the Tokyo round in the 70s, and the Uruguay round, which ended in the 1990s, which then led to the formation of the WTO. Pretty much amongst developed countries, average, what MFN stands for is most favored nation. You can think of that as the bound tariffs of the developed countries on average were averaging 3.4%. And when China acceded to the WTO in 2001, as an emerging economy, it was able to accede with a pretty large reduction in its average tariffs, but it came into the WTO with its tariffs averaging about 9.6%, a little bit lower actually against the US. Now, the way the system has traditionally moved forward, we would have another round of trade negotiations. The Doha round is pretty much, you can either think of it as being dead or it's certainly on ice. If we'd had another round, we might have got China to bring down its tariffs further, along with countries like India giving access, particularly in the agricultural sector. But we never got an agreement out of Doha. Pretty much Doha broke down in 2008. So the US has essentially taken a unilateral position here, and it's come in and it's raised tariffs. And it's essentially moved the US into that yellow box, power-based bargaining, with a view to trying to get the Chinese to come to the negotiating table and lower their tariffs. Not surprisingly, any game theorist would tell you the US broke the rules of the WTO by unilaterally implementing these tariffs. The national security argument doesn't hold any water, and many countries have taken the US to the WTO in a trade dispute. China necessarily reacted as you would expect. And initially, of course, it picked on the three top export sectors of the US to China: automobiles, aircraft, and soybeans. So we've effectively moved into that mustardy brown box down there in the right-hand corner, where we've moved away from a cooperative game between countries in the WTO to essentially particularly a non-cooperative game between the US and China. And I don't know how well this graph has come out. Let me see if I'm actually over here and talk really loud. Over here is January 2018. You can think of that as the start of the trade war. On average, the US had tariffs of 3.1% against China. China had tariffs of 8% on average against the US. And you can see these are being ratcheted up. September 2018, Chinese had average tariffs of 18% against the US 12 against China. We moved here, they're starting to converge on each other. 16% for China against the US, 12% for the US against China, right up to where, if all the tariffs were implemented this November, we pretty much on average have 25% tariffs against each other. To put that in perspective, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, and I don't think anybody in the room is old enough to remember the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of the 1930s. It's a matter of economic history. The tariffs were averaging 35% for the US. So we're getting quite close to US tariffs against China are almost up to what they were before China joined the WTO, and we're heading in the direction of what was happening in the 1930s. So basically, the power-based bargaining approach doesn't seem to have worked right now. I mean, they're at the negotiating table, but neither side has actually cut tariffs yet. Secondly, and you hear a lot about this, the trade war was partially instigated by the administration to reduce the trade deficit. Now, if you were here last year, you should remember what I told you last year, and I waxed lyrical about it, if I remember rightly. Tariffs are not a good way to try to resolve the trade deficit, either in aggregate or bilaterally against China. It is a macroeconomic issue. In other words, it's driven by the low US savings rate and the fiscal deficit in the US. And I talked about that last year. Go back to my slides last year on my webpage and you can revisit that argument. So just to put that in perspective, here's where we are on the US goods trade balance. That's the red line. This excludes services. So I'm just looking at the goods part of the trade deficit. We ended last year just under $900 billion worth of trade deficit. That's imported goods exceed exported goods. Right now, as of August, that was running at 588 billion for this year. And I checked back at August 2018, we're already running ahead of where we were last August. So my prediction is that the US goods trade deficit is going to be running at over 900 billion or thereabouts at the end of this fiscal financial year. The blue line is the Chinese or the US-China bilateral trade deficit. So that's us importing more from China than we export, and that's been a lot of the focus of the administration. Currently, that's running at $231 billion. We ended last year somewhere between $450 and $500 billion in terms of the goods trade deficit. Now, all those two curves would shift up, especially the red one, if you added in trade and services, because the US is a net exporter of services. But nevertheless, we're still running a trade deficit in aggregate. It hasn't improved since the trade war began. In fact, it's got worse. Third, the argument is to target Chinese exchange rate manipulation. So prior to August 2019, when China was accused by the US Treasury of being a currency manipulator, China did not actually meet any of the key criteria of either the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, or the Treasury for being an exchange rate manipulator. So what are the criteria for manipulation? It's important to look at these because you see a lot of nonsense written in the popular media about this. First of all, you have to observe intervention by the Chinese or any other country to push down the value of their currency if they're trying to depreciate their currency deliberately. In other words, you would expect to see China doing what? Selling renminbi, that's their currency, on the world market from their own reserves, or buying up foreign currency in order to push down the value of the renminbi. That's basically what you'd expect to see. Second, you'd expect to see a country that's manipulating its currency to have a very large current account surplus. China has a large current account surplus, but I'll explain to you in a minute what the benchmark is by both the US Treasury and the IMF. Thirdly, and this is the criteria that the Treasury adds, is that a country should have a large bilateral trade surplus with the US, and China clearly does have a large bilateral trade surplus with the US. Here's what the history tells you. Here's what the data tells you. So pre-2014, here's a graph of the US dollar versus the renminbi. This is kind of back to front thinking, but this is, if you look at that long flat section from 1995 through to about 2005, 2006, that's when China pegged its currency at just over 8 renminbi to the dollar. They freed up that explicit peg to what economists call a dirty float. And by a dirty float, I mean they didn't just peg their currency to the dollar, but they pegged it to a basket of currencies, including the euro, the Japanese yen, and some other major currencies globally. And after that peg was relaxed in the mid-2000s, what you see is the number of renminbi that you can start to get for the dollar starts to diminish. And what that means is the Chinese currency was actually appreciating. So you'll see about a 30% appreciation in the renminbi against the dollar over that period, okay? But what the Chinese were doing, and this is why we did accuse them of currency manipulation, they were slowing down the appreciation of their currency when they initially relaxed the peg. But then in 2015, 2016, you can see this where the currency starts to depreciate again, and then it starts to appreciate again. China spent $1 trillion propping up its currency. They have $4 trillion worth of foreign exchange reserves. That is unheard of. And they used a quarter of it propping up their currency. So there's been a period until very recently where China actively tried to keep up its currency as opposed to allowing it to depreciate on the international market. By 2016-18, China's current account surplus only averaged 1% of their GDP. The Treasury cutoff, the IMF cutoff is 3%. So China doesn't meet the criteria that it's manipulating its currency by selling it. It doesn't meet the criteria by which its trade surplus is more than 3% or 3% of GDP. And the bilateral trade deficit argument doesn't really hold any water, because even if the US had balanced trade, either on aggregate or with China in particular, and if there were no currency manipulation, and right now the IMF is not accusing anybody globally of manipulating their currency, and that's true of other organizations who study this, even if you had balanced trade, no currency manipulation, the US could still have a bilateral trade deficit with China. Why? Because China has a comparative advantage in assembling goods with relatively low labor costs. That's been true since China started its export-led growth in the 1990s, and particularly when it took off when it joined the WTO. So China, even if it weren't manipulating its currency, it had been manipulating, even if we had a bilateral trade balance, in aggregate, we could still have a bilateral trade imbalance with China. So let me go back to the last point, and I think this is the one you really need to pay attention to, because this is the one that most economists do agree on. There's a lot of concerns over Chinese trade practices, but I would argue there's a lot of risk associated with a unilateral approach by the US towards China. What are these Chinese trade practices? And this was recorded in 2018. This was the start of the trade war. This is the US Trade Representative's report that came out in 2018. And you've probably seen many of these lists before in the media. 1, forced technology transfer through joint ventures. 2, discriminatory licensing restrictions. In other words, Chinese firms get more favorable licensing contracts than, say, non-Chinese firms operating in China. The one you've heard most about, theft of intellectual property. In other words, this is where the Chinese steal blueprints, ideas, etc., from US and other firms. Restrictions by the Chinese on investment by non-Chinese firms in China. But most importantly, and if you read the US Trade Representative's report in 2018 and the follow-up report by the Treasury, the major discussion is over state-owned enterprises in China and the use of subsidies either by the state or by the Chinese Communist Party in order to help them in export markets, or at least to compete more successfully against American and other firms, both in the global and the Chinese market. The key issue here is, what's the extent to which, and this is what a trade lawyer in a well-known article that gets cited everywhere, this was in the Harvard International Business Law Review, he calls China, China Incorporated. China essentially has a parallel system where you have the state, the Chinese state, and then you have the Chinese Communist Party, and the Chinese Communist Party has set up networks within the state-owned enterprises, within the financial sector. And the problem is, it's really quite difficult to pinpoint where the Chinese state is using subsidies and where these subsidies look like they're coming from a private network. And herein lies the problem. The WTO can only target subsidies delivered by a state. They can't target subsidies that are delivered by a non-state entity. Having said that, there are plenty of ways in which the US could place a WTO case under the GATT. I won't bore you with the legal details, GATT Article 23, that one or more of the measures that I just listed nullify or impair the benefits of the US and other WTO members under the agreement when China acceded to the WTO. Having said that, I think the only way to approach this is through a grand coalition of countries. And here I'm quoting Jennifer Hillman, who was a judge at the US International Trade Commission, and she was also a US appointed judge on the WTO Appellate Board and retired sometime in the early 2000s from that job. Now, it's true that the US is really frustrated with dispute settlement in the WTO. I'm not going to talk about that other than to say the US believes there's been judicial overreach, particularly by lawyers on the WTO Appellate Board. We can talk about that if you want to. But the problem with the US adopting a unilateral approach to China is that I think we're going to get a shallow deal. And by a shallow deal, I mean a deal that focuses on trying to reduce the US trade deficit, try to restore trade in agricultural exports to China, but not really address the substantive issues, particularly as they relate to subsidies. Secondly, if the EU and Japan are not in on this, they're simply going to free ride on any agreement that China and the US come up with, especially if it relates to things like intellectual property. And thirdly, I think there's a very strong potential to undermine the World Trade Organization, both implicitly and explicitly through the actions of both China and the United States. So let me finish off by just saying a few comments about phase one of the trade agreement. That apparently there's going to be more than one phase. We haven't had phase one yet. I'm not particularly optimistic that we're going to see a phase one, but here's what you see discussed in the media. One, they're going to pause the increase in tariffs, and we've actually seen that. My one piece of advice, if you want a new one of these, buy it by December 15th, 2015, when the tariffs are going to go in on these. We are going to see a significant increase in US tariffs on imported consumer goods, which is really going to hurt American consumers. So we've seen a pause, and the US has held off on implementing a couple of rounds of additional tariffs. Secondly, there's an expectation that there really will be concessions on enforcement of intellectual property rights. China already has rules in place. They've promised to tighten them up. One thing that's really interesting, and I was talking to Dr. Lyons, Alan Lyons, about this the other day, many Chinese firms that are very innovative themselves want to protect intellectual property. So there's a lot of lobbying pressure by domestic firms on the Chinese government to implement intellectual property right protection, not just because of satisfying the US and other trading countries. Third, and this is the one most of you in the room probably want to hear about, is the Chinese, in principle, have made commitments on agricultural imports. You've probably heard ridiculous numbers bandied about. I'm not going to say by whom, but there was a commitment to increase imports in 2 years to $50 billion. How much, what was the peak of our imports into China? $27 billion about 3 or 4 years ago. I think it might be reasonable to argue within 2 years, if they took away all the tariffs, that we could restore our exports to maybe what, 17, 18 billion, if we haven't already lost market share permanently to countries like Brazil in the case of soybeans. So it's not clear to me exactly how you can double imports overnight. If the Chinese government is committing to doing this, and this is probably in violation of WTO rules, I can't believe Brazil would be very happy about it. What economists want to see, get rid of the tariffs, let market prices do their job. China's also made commitments on this currency issue. I personally don't believe they need to do it, but I guess this is a way they're moving forward the negotiations. And this would actually be the first time that we've ever seen any kind of commitment in some kind of trade agreement on currency, except for what was originally going to go into the Trans-Pacific Partnership. What's not in the agreement? Nothing has been done to address the US's use of subsidies targeted to state-owned enterprises. That was the reason we started the trade war in the first place. This is all about dumping, use of countervailing duties. It's not even mentioned in any of the press releases coming out of the administration, and the Chinese certainly aren't talking about it. So in conclusion, trade war is already imposing costs on the US, which will only increase as the trade war intensifies. There's a significant downside risk to the global economy. One reason that you're seeing the Federal Reserve lower rates, one reason you're seeing the European Central Bank lower rates, one reason you're seeing the UK's Bank of England talking about lowering rates is because of the potential threat of a recession. I think we're not quite as close as to one as we were, because the yield inversion that we saw about 3 or 4 months ago has actually backed off. So we don't see that yield inversion. That's where short-term rates were higher than long-term rates. Normally we should see a positive yield curve. So I think the US-China trade deal is going to be shallow. I think it's going to be targeted at the deficit with little focus behind the border. In other words, the rules that China does or doesn't impose on things like IP protection. And I think a coalition of WTO members would do a much better job of solving this problem. Finally, and I want to leave you to think about this, failure of the US to follow the global trading system, the rules-based system, runs the risk that China will not follow the system if and when, and I would put emphasis on when, not if, when it becomes the global economic power. China actually has a very good track record of abiding by WTO rulings. In the 30 that have gone against them since they joined the WTO in 2001, they have followed the ruling either of the panel or the appellate board. And as you probably know, we've recently had, Carl, is it 2 or 3, 2 cases in agriculture that the US won against China, and then there's every expectation that they're going to meet the rulings of the WTO in that case. And I finally remind you that the US has just been the winner, if you like, of the largest ruling in the WTO ever. That relates to the Boeing Airbus case, where the US has been allowed to implement 7.5 billion tariffs against European imports because the EU was using export subsidies to export Airbus aircraft. Yeah, the dispute took 15 years to solve, but if you want a legal, rules-based system, you've got to let the legal system do its job. Thanks very much. I'm happy to take any questions. I'm going to hang around, I'm going to talk to some media, but trying to poke, yeah, so. Well, I imagine Ben's going to talk about that in more detail, but as you know, the question was about the pork industry. So as you all know, we've talked about this previously, Chinese demand for meat products has skyrocketed since pretty much the beginning of the Chinese economic reforms in the early 1980s. And there was massive expansion of their pork production industry. My brother, one of his jobs now is working for the British government is to go and sell British pork production systems in China. So the Chinese obviously are having to feed those animals, and were part of the increase in soybean production up to what, $14 billion worth of imports of US soybeans before the trade war began. Now, as you all know, there's been an outbreak of African swine fever, which is what the gentleman up back there is referring to. So of course, what's that meant? We've seen it means there's a softening of demand for feeding those animals in China because they're either dying or they're being slaughtered. But at the same time, Chinese pork prices are going up, and pork is an important part of the Chinese diet. And at the same time, in the initial round of the trade war, China implemented a tariff of what then, 72% against processed pork imports. So I think what we're seeing is, I don't think they've relaxed the tariff yet, but we're seeing, because prices are so high in China, it means the tariff is not as binding as it was. So we're seeing, I don't know what the growth rates are, but we've seen fairly significant increase in processed pork imports, both from the US and other suppliers. So you get this interesting trade-off. We're not exporting soybeans directly, but we potentially have the ability to export soybeans implicitly through processed pork. So, you know, I don't know how long that outbreak's going to go on, whether it's going to spread outside of China, but that's certainly been one of the reasons, and Ben may show this, of the not just the US export price, but the Brazilian export price softened quite a bit because of that African swine fever outbreak. So yeah, they need processed pork. Carl.
The uptick in Chinese dairy imports caught everyone by surprise. Is that a short-term deal or long-term?
I find that surprising because the Chinese, if I understand them physiologically, they tend to be lactose intolerant. So it's kind of surprising to me that they're importing dairy products. Now, you know, when I've been to Beijing and stayed in, you know, major American hotel chains, they've obviously served up dairy products to non-Chinese consumers. But generally, as I understand it, dairy products are not a large part of their diet. So there must be some kind of there must be some group in China who are switching their preferences, but I don't know much about that. Ben, can you comment on that? As I understand it, it's part of their makeup. I mean, there's Chinese people in the room. I mean, I can't speak for them directly, but as I understand it, there's not a large dairy component to the Chinese diet. I mean, their oils are through soy. Brian?
Yeah, dairy consumption's gone up considerably in China over the past 2 decades.
So there you go. They're still lactose intolerant, as I understand it. And I guess that changes over time. You get more lactose tolerant. I don't know. I'm not an expert on dairy. Alan.
Currency manipulation. Your argument is it's not happening. Some writers that are saying something like this: the Chinese high appetite for the U.S. dollar strengthening the U.S. dollar, therefore not allowing appreciation of people.
That was happening when when the Chinese trade surplus was running as strongly as it was. The way China runs its monetary policy through the People's Bank of China is not through interest rates like we do here in the US, or at least not as extensively as we rely on the Fed. They do it through, they sterilize all that hot money coming into China from their trade surplus, and they do it through forcing people either to buy very low yielding, if not negative yielding, bank deposits in China, or they recycle it back to the US and purchasing US treasuries. But China's completely reshaped its sovereign investment fund. It's moved away from treasuries. It's diversified away a little bit. There's no doubt that China was trying to prop up its currency. They spent $1 trillion. Nobody's ever spent that much trying to prop up a currency. The other thing I didn't say is that you can't have it both ways. The US has pushed China to come away from a peg to a flexible exchange rate. When you have a flexible exchange rate, assuming that they're not manipulating their currency, a currency should do what? It should follow market forces. So when the US slaps tariffs, as I showed you, on imports, what does that mean Americans are not doing? We're cutting our imports of Chinese goods. What does that mean? That means we're not buying renminbi. What does that mean for the Chinese currency? There's a natural tendency for it to depreciate. So a lot of what this is just natural market forces because of the trade war. And I, like Jeffrey Frankel at Harvard, have written extensively on this, and the argument is it was entirely political when the Treasury accused them of being a manipulator. Now, having said that, China's been on the watch list for some time, and we monitor China all the time. So I would push back. I don't believe that's going on right now, not to the extent that it was when they first came off their peg. Bailey's trying to get me off the stage, so I'll be happy to answer any more questions over lunch or this afternoon. Thanks very much for listening.